The hatch slammed shut with a metallic thud. Hot oil stung the nostrils as the engine coughed, then roared alive, shaking the hull like a beast caged in steel. Tracks bit into frozen soil, clattering over rock and ruin. Through the narrow slit of a periscope, flashes of light burst. Muzzle fire, white and violent. A gunner steadied his breath. "On!" he shouted. The turret slewed. The 75 thundered, recoil rattling bones. One tank among thousands. One sound among a continent of metal. It was a paradox that defined the war. Germany fielded the apex of armored design. Panthers with their high-velocity guns, Tigers with their slabs of thick steel, and the dreaded 88. Against them, America sent a tank some called too tall, too thin, undergunned. The M4 Sherman was not the best tank, but it was built in nearly 49,000 copies. Which wins a war? The perfect machine, or the machine that never stops arriving? The M4 weighed 30 tons in its first models, climbed to 33 as armor thickened. It could roll at 25 miles per hour on road. Its 75mm gun hurled high explosive that infantry loved, and armor-piercing that did the job up close. Later, 76mm barrels in the British 17-pounder stretched its bite. The secret wasn't in the blueprint, it was in the count. In 1940, America's tank production was a curiosity. By 1942, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant alone shipped more than 1,000 Shermans a month. By war's end, the total would approach 49,000 M4s. German officers stared at the numbers and wrote one line: "The Americans manufacture like a nation at war." The assembly lines had their own sensory rhythm. Sparks cascaded from welders in showers of light. Overhead cranes groaned, carrying hulls across cavernous floors. Fresh paint smelled chemical and sharp in winter air. On a good week in 1943, 20 Shermans a day rolled out of one facility. Men learned new jobs in hours. Women measured tolerances with micrometers until steel felt like cloth. A foreman put it bluntly: "We are not building tanks, we are building time." The shock of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 tested those claims. Dust swirled above the Tunisian ridges, stinging eyes and clogging engines. American crews were green, nervous inside their tall silhouettes. German veterans waited with long-barreled Panzer IVs and 50mm anti-tank guns. Within hours, Shermans burned. More than 180 American tanks of all types were lost in 2 weeks. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim wrote that U.S. armor attacked bravely but clumsily, in a manner not suited to the field. For a moment it seemed the Sherman was folly. Yet even in defeat, the math whispered. By April, fresh shipments had already replaced the losses. Convoys disgorged more M4s at North African ports. What took Germany months to manufacture, America replaced in weeks. When the Axis surrendered in May, 250,000 prisoners marched into captivity. Allied armor had taken heavy blows but had not run dry. That was the lesson of Tunisia. Quality could win a day. Quantity could win a campaign. The sensory memory was sharp. German gunners watched Shermans crest ridges like tall targets on a wall. American crews remembered the horror of penetration. Noise, flame, and the acrid taste of cordite as shells ignited. Yet after-action reports carried one refrain: "We had tanks again the next day." That sentence carried the promise of an industrial army. From Tunisia, the tide flowed into Sicily. July 1943, Operation Husky. 600 tanks, half of them Shermans, rolled ashore under burning heat. Engines boiled, dust clogged filters, crews sweated through uniforms soaked with grime. Yet the Shermans pushed inland, blasting bunkers, silencing machine gun nests. Infantry followed in their wake. The 75mm high-explosive round proved its worth, tearing through stone houses where German troops resisted. A German officer complained bitterly: "Their gun is not superior, but it kills our men in stone walls. We lose the battle, though our tanks survive." Italy tested the Sherman further. Salerno, Anzio, the Liri Valley. Mud swallowed tracks. Rivers and mines slowed every advance. German Tigers prowled in ambush, their 88mm guns piercing Shermans at long range. At Cisterna, entire companies were wiped out in minutes. Survivors spoke of the terrifying crack, the scream of tearing metal, the silence that followed inside a destroyed hull. Yet replacements arrived. Rail cars unloaded new tanks at Naples. Recovery crews dragged hulks rearward. Workshops patched, welded, and returned machines to service. What the Germans called irrecoverable often reappeared on U.S. rosters within weeks. Ethics bent under the weight of numbers. Geneva Convention spoke of prisoners, not production rates. Was it just to feed young crews into machines vulnerable to the Tiger's guns? Critics argued the Sherman condemned men unfairly. Historians point out that industrial abundance saved more lives overall. Infantry had constant support. Offensives did not stall. Wars shortened. Mercy sometimes wore the mask of mass production. By 1944, the lesson was clear. German officers nicknamed the Sherman the Locust. Individually weak, collectively unstoppable. One wrote, "They come in swarms, and when you destroy one, 5 more arrive." Numbers bore him out. By mid-1943, over 8,000 Shermans had been delivered to Britain, and hundreds more to the Soviet Union and Free French. By D-Day, more than 5,000 waited in Britain for the invasion of France. The night before June 6th, the Channel was a cauldron of sound. Engines drummed, waves slapped steel, diesel fumes hung heavy. Inside landing craft sat Shermans chained to decks, crews tense. At dawn, Omaha became a slaughterhouse. Duplex drive Shermans sank in rough seas, crews drowning as canvas skirts tore. Survivors remembered seawater filling lungs, the horror of dying inside steel coffins. But others made it ashore. Turrets turned, 75s roared, clearing bunkers that had pinned infantry. A soldier recalled, "When the Shermans came, the men rose again. We followed them into hell because they made a path." Within a week, 2,000 Shermans were ashore. They came as a tide. Cranes swung them from Liberty ships night and day. German defenders destroyed dozens in ambushes, but by dusk more rolled down from beaches. The duel was endless, arithmetic brutal. Normandy's hedgerows turned every field into a fortress. Panthers and tigers waited in ambush. At Villers-Bocage, a single tiger commanded by Michael Whitman destroyed a dozen Shermans and carriers in minutes. Survivors remembered the sudden eruption of fire, the smell of burning rubber and flesh. Yet the river did not dry. Within days, replacements filled the line. Engineers welded steel tusks to tanks so they could burst through hedgerows. Platoons learned to coordinate, one Sherman breaking, others following, infantry close. Losses continued, but ground was gained. German officers wrote with frustration, "The American tank is not superior to ours, yet they appear in inexhaustible numbers. Each village we hold is attacked by companies of them, and when one is destroyed, another comes." The admission was reluctant but undeniable. Duels could be won, campaigns could not. The bocage reeked of manure, smoke, and cordite. Inside hulls, men sweated in cramped steel, shells stacked at their knees. Radios crackled endlessly. At night they slept on warm decks, staring at tracer arcs overhead. Panthers ruled the duel, but broke down, guzzled fuel, and could not be replaced. A division might start June with 150 Panthers and end August with a handful. Against them stood thousands of Shermans, replenished daily. The question of morality sharpened again. Was it right to send men and machines known to be vulnerable? Yet without Shermans, infantry would have faced bunkers and machine guns alone. The alternative was a stalled front, more dead, a longer war. Numbers became mercy. By July, Operation Cobra unleashed the river. 1,500 Shermans rolled through gaps blasted by bombers. German lines crumbled. Villages fell in hours. At the Falaise pocket, trapped German units saw Shermans on every road. Survivors called it nightmare. We saw their tanks everywhere. Our guns could not turn fast enough. By September 1944, more than 10,000 Shermans fought in Northwest Europe. Against them, Germany fielded under 2,000 serviceable tanks. The duel was finished. Panthers and tigers could still frighten, still kill, but they could not change the war. The numbers had become destiny. Autumn 1944 settled over Europe with mud and fatigue. After the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, Allied columns slowed. Fuel ran thin, supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Shermans parked in fields, their engines idling more than advancing. Crews scraped mud from tracks, slept under canvas, and wondered if the war was nearing its end. The front seemed quiet. It was only the pause before a storm. Hitler planned one last blow. He chose the Ardennes, dense forests, narrow roads, valleys choked with snow. In December, more than 1,000 German tanks and assault guns gathered, including Panthers, Tigers, and the massive Tiger II. Their goal was Antwerp. Their method was shock. At dawn on December 16th, the offensive began. Shells rained, infantry swarmed, and the forests shook. For Sherman crews, the Ardennes became hell-frozen. Snow muffled sound, then shattered it with sudden blasts. An 88mm firing in the white silence felt like the world tearing. Visibility shrank to a few dozen meters. Panthers emerged from fog like ghosts, their guns roaring first. At St. Vith, American units lost dozens of Shermans in hours. Survivors remembered the bitter smell of burning gasoline mingled with pine smoke. Yet the river held. Within days, new Shermans rolled forward. Trains unloaded them behind the lines. Convoys pushed them through icy roads. Crews climbed into steel still smelling of factory paint. A battalion that lost half its tanks one week fought again near full strength the next. German units, by contrast, bled machines they could not replace. Every Tiger II lost was a disaster. Every Sherman lost was an entry on a replacement sheet soon erased. At Bastogne, encircled American forces relied on Shermans as both shield and sword. Their 75mm guns struggled against Panther fronts, but flanking fire, bazookas, and artillery evened the odds. When the weather cleared, Allied aircraft roared overhead, hammering German convoys caught on snowy lanes. Shermans pressed forward, turrets frosted, tracks grinding through ice. "We were never alone," one infantryman said. "There was always another tank behind the hill." U.S. National Archives, 1946. German diaries from the offensive reveal despair. A Panther commander wrote, "We kill them, we kill many, but every night more come. We cannot stop the flow." Red Cross Report, 1945. By January 1945, the offensive collapsed. Germany lost more than 600 armored vehicles. American losses were also high, nearly 700 Shermans destroyed or damaged. But the difference remained. America could replace them. Germany could not. The sensory rhythm of the Ardennes was exhaustion. Crews shivered in frozen hulls, breath frosting on periscope glass. Radios crackled with static as snow dampened signals. Engines coughed in cold mornings, oil thick as syrup. Yet still the tanks moved. Tank destroyers joined them. Half-tracks followed. Supply trucks ground forward. The sound was relentless steel against relentless winter. The ethical question sharpened. Was it just to send men into tanks vulnerable to Panther fire at long range? Critics called the Sherman a death trap. Yet the alternative was worse. Without numbers, the front might have buckled. A longer war would have meant more death. Historians still debate, but the paradox remains. Mass production shortened the war, saving more lives than it cost. By February 1945, the tide had turned again. Germany's last reserves were gone. The Ardennes offensive had consumed fuel, steel, and men the Reich could not spare. Shermans rolled east once more across the Siegfried Line toward the Rhine. The duel had been costly, but the lesson was the same. Tactical brilliance cannot defeat strategic arithmetic. In March, the Rhine itself fell. At Remagen, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact. Within hours, Shermans rumbled across, turrets scanning the hills, crews tense under artillery fire. German attempts to destroy the bridge failed. The tanks crossed in steady rhythm, each one a heartbeat of invasion. Photographs show their silhouettes against iron girders, smoke rising behind them, a procession of inevitability. German resistance stiffened in Cologne. A Panther lay in ambush, destroying several Shermans before being flanked and killed. A combat cameraman caught it on film. The footage became iconic. German armor still lethal but doomed against numbers. For every Panther, there were 5 Shermans. For every ambush, a counterstrike. By April, more than 4,000 Shermans pushed through Germany. They cut off pockets of resistance, rolled through towns reduced to rubble, filled city squares with green hulks. Civilians watched in silence as columns passed. The air reeked of cordite, diesel, and spring blossoms crushed under tracks. Children peeked from ruins as turrets turned, symbols of conquest and liberation in one. German diaries grew resigned. "We have machines that are lions," one officer wrote, "but they are alone in the forest." U.S. National Archives, 1946. Fuel shortages immobilized many Panthers before they reached battle. Tiger IIs broke down and were abandoned, too heavy to recover. Against them surged Shermans with spare parts, fuel convoys, mechanics ready to patch damage overnight. At the Ruhr pocket, 300,000 German troops were encircled. Shermans formed the armored walls of the trap, blocking roads, blasting resistance, forcing surrender. One German soldier recalled, "Every road we tried was blocked by their tanks. It was as if the earth itself produced them." Red Cross Report, 1945. The ethical capsule returned. For German civilians, Shermans were both destroyers and protectors. For some, they meant food from Allied kitchens. For others, they meant humiliation. Historians ask, was the Sherman a blunt hammer or the fastest route to peace? Perhaps it was both. Each month, the war shortened, spared tens of thousands of lives. In Berlin, it was not the Sherman that struck the final blow. That belonged to the Soviet T-34. But Shermans had made the blow possible. By carrying the war deep into Germany, they tied down divisions, drained reserves, and shattered the Wehrmacht's last strength. When the Red Army reached the capital, it faced an enemy already broken by months of attrition against the Allied river of steel. The sensory close of the war was both triumph and exhaustion. Crews leaned from turrets, faces gaunt, uniforms blackened. Children touched hulls with wonder or fear. Engines idled in conquered squares as commanders accepted surrenders. Towns like Leipzig and Magdeburg saw Shermans parked beside churches, symbols of an end forged in industry. The final numbers told the story. 49,000 built, 17,000 lost, 30,000 still running at war's end. Germany's best had not been enough. The duel had been settled not in a single battlefield, but in factories, convoys, and rail yards. The weapon Germany could not stop was not a tank. It was the idea that numbers could outlast genius. The guns fell silent in May 1945, but the Shermans did not vanish. Across Europe, armored columns idled in captured cities, their engines ticking down, their turrets turned toward nothing. Crews climbed off hulls for the last time, the smell of burnt oil still clinging to their uniforms. Victory had been achieved, yet the machines remained. Nearly 49,000 had been built. The world was now saturated with them. America faced a choice: scrap them, store them, or share them. The answer became all three. Thousands of Shermans were driven to depots, lined up row upon row, steel monuments to production. Many were cut for scrap, their metal recycled into peacetime goods. But tens of thousands were shipped abroad. France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium. Nations liberated by Sherman columns rebuilt their armies with the very machines that had freed them. The tank of America became the tank of half the world. The sensory echo of post-war Europe was quieter but still metallic. Villagers watched Shermans in parades instead of battles, flags painted on turrets, soldiers saluting as tracks rattled over cobblestones. Children climbed onto hulls and slid down glacis plates, their laughter replacing the crack of gunfire. The smell of fuel and grease still drifted, but it was no longer the smell of destruction. It was the scent of guardianship. In Asia, the Sherman crossed new frontiers. China received shipments during the late war, and after 1945, more arrived to support fragile armies. In 1948, Israel fought its War of Independence with Shermans purchased from scrapyards, refitted in secret workshops. Crews welded spare plates, scavenged ammunition, and drove the old M4s into battle. Against lighter Arab armor, the Sherman was still formidable. For Israel, it was more than a machine. It was survival embodied in steel. Latin America became another Sherman landscape. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico deployed M4s through the 1950s. In jungles, mountains, and deserts, the tanks adapted to terrains far removed from Normandy hedgerows. On boulevards, they appeared in parades, their presence more political than military. The clatter of tracks in Caracas or Rio de Janeiro carried echoes of Europe's battlefields, reminders that America's wartime output had become a global inheritance. The Korean War reignited the Sherman's combat role. By 1950, many had been relegated to reserves. But when North Korea surged south with Soviet-built T-34-85s, the Sherman returned. American forces deployed M4A3E8 EZ-8 variants with improved suspension and high-velocity 76mm guns. On Korean hills, Shermans faced T-34s in duels that echoed the Eastern Front. Reports note that in many engagements, the outcome was decided less by design than by crews and numbers. Shermans destroyed T-34s at range. T-34s destroyed Shermans in ambushes. It was a stalemate of steel, but one that bought time until newer tanks arrived. The sensory experience of Korea was brutal. Crews shivered in freezing mountains, engines straining in snow, shells stacked beside knees. Inside the hulls, men smelled cordite mingled with kimchi from local markets. Tracks rattled over bridges thrown up in haste. Gunners peered through fog at dark silhouettes. The Sherman had returned to war a decade after its birth, proving still viable. Ethical debates stirred again. Should soldiers be sent into battle in tanks already considered obsolete? Geneva offered no guidance. Historians today argue that the Sherman's presence was less about superiority and more about availability. When war erupted suddenly, the weapon on hand became the weapon of survival. In that sense, the Sherman's endurance was a kind of mercy. Better an old tank than none. The Soviet perspective added irony. During the war, Moscow had received over 4,000 Shermans through Lend-Lease. Crews often respected the American tank for reliability. It starts in the cold, one Soviet tanker recalled, and it goes where you point it. U.S. National Archives, 1946. After 1945, the USSR watched with suspicion as Shermans armed NATO allies, guarding borders in Europe. For the Soviets, the M4 was not just a tank. It was influence, steel as diplomacy. Numbers again told the story. By the early 1950s, Shermans served in more than 20 armies. Some were frontline, others reserves. The United States phased them out gradually, but allies kept them alive. In the Middle East, they fought into the 1970s. In South America, they rolled in parades. In museums, they became monuments. Few machines of war ever traveled so widely. Israel transformed them most dramatically. In the 1950s and 60s, Israeli engineers refitted M4 hulls with French 105mm guns, creating hybrids known as Super Shermans. They fought in the Six-Day War of 1967, blasting enemy armor and fortifications. Though obsolete by Western standards, they proved lethal in the right hands. Photographs of Shermans cresting desert dunes under Israeli flags testified to their second life. For veterans, the legacy was personal. Many returned to see Shermans preserved in museums. They touched the steel they once lived inside. Some cursed the memory. Others smiled. All remembered. "It was ugly," one veteran said, "but it was ours, and it got us home." Red Cross Report, 1945. The sensory echoes of preservation carry weight. In towns across Europe, Shermans stand as memorials, turrets lifted toward the sky. Rain streaks down their armor, rust creeping into seams. Children climb them still, unaware of the terror they once carried. The tanks became monuments not to firepower, but to endurance. Ethical questions linger. Was it mercy or cruelty to rely on an imperfect tank? Was it wisdom or waste to keep it in service for decades? Historians debate, but consensus leans toward inevitability. The Sherman was not perfect, but it was sufficient. Its sufficiency, multiplied, became decisive. Its longevity, extended, became global. By the 1960s, the Sherman faded from American service, but lived on abroad. Chile modernized its hulls with new engines and fire control systems. Lebanon and Jordan deployed them. Even in the 1980s, some rolled in conflicts, relics of a world war still fighting in regional wars. The M4 outlived many of its critics, a machine that refused to die. Cultural memory sealed its place. In films, the Sherman became the cinematic tank of victory, roaring through villages with soldiers waving. In German accounts, it was the relentless foe, never glamorous, always present. In Soviet writings, it was respected but ordinary. Each narrative carried the same undertone. It mattered less how good it was, more how many there were. The final irony rests in preservation. More than 70 years after its debut, dozens still run. Engines cough to life at reenactments, their smoke acrid, their clatter nostalgic. Crowds cheer as the old machines rumble past. In their steel, the paradox still whispers, not the best, but the one that could not be stopped. When the last fires of World War II smoldered into silence, the Sherman's reputation was already contested. Soldiers who had fought inside it remembered both terror and relief. German gunners had called it a coffin. American infantry had called it salvation. Historians decades later would balance both truths. Yet one fact was beyond dispute. The Sherman, flawed as it was, had carried armies across continents and brought them to victory. Numbers anchored its legacy. Nearly 49,000 built, 17,000 lost, 30,000 still in service when peace was signed. Germany's vaunted Panthers and Tigers together barely reached 8,000. The imbalance was staggering. One German general confessed after the war, "We produced masterpieces, but they produced victory." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The masterpieces had their qualities. The Panther's sloped armor and 75mm high-velocity gun were technical marvels. The Tiger's armor deflected most Allied rounds. Its 88 tore through Shermans with ease at over 1,000 meters. In a duel, the German cats often won. But duels do not win wars alone. Shermans moved faster, lasted longer, and above all, came in numbers the Reich could not imagine. A German tank battalion in Normandy might field 100 Panthers on paper, but half would break down before combat. Fuel shortages immobilized others. Maintenance consumed hours the front could not spare. Meanwhile, an American unit struck losses in one column, then filled its rosters with replacements within days. Mechanics swapped engines under electric lights, spare parts delivered on convoys that never stopped. The comparison was brutal. One army fought with machines. The other fought with a system. Sensory contrasts revealed this truth. German mechanics knelt in frozen mud, trying to lift transmissions too heavy for field cranes. American mechanics replaced engines in depots, humming with generators, music playing on radios. A Wehrmacht report lamented, "For every hour our tank moves, we spend 2 repairing. For every hour theirs moves, they spend 1 preparing the next." Red Cross report, 1945. Strategically, the Sherman became the blunt instrument of momentum. Blitzkrieg had stunned the world with speed in 1939. But by 1943, tempo no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to America. Divisions with hundreds of Shermans advanced on multiple axes, sustained pressure, and never let the front cool. By 1944, German commanders admitted they had lost initiative permanently. Their tanks fought duels, Shermans fought campaigns. The ethical capsule surfaces here. Was it just a fight with machines vulnerable to enemy guns? Critics call it a betrayal of crews. Yet historians argue differently. Without Sherman numbers, campaigns would have stalled, costing millions more lives in years of attrition. In this view, mercy was not in armor thickness but in mass production that shortened the war. It was not a perfect solution. It was the least costly among terrible choices. Military academies studied the Sherman after the war. Not as an ideal weapon, but as a proof of principle. Future planners asked, what wins wars, quality or quantity? The Cold War gave its answer, both. NATO built fleets of standardized tanks, aircraft, and ships, each not the pinnacle but sufficient, reproducible, and sustainable. The Soviet Union drew the same conclusion from its T-34. Both sides armed themselves less for duels, more for endurance. Cultural memory gave the Sherman its paradoxical image. In American films, it was the liberator, roaring through French villages with soldiers waving. In German memoirs, it was the relentless foe, countless and unstoppable. In Soviet recollections, it was dependable but ordinary. The shared undertone, it mattered less how good it was, more how many there were. The numbers echo even now. Analysts calculated that Shermans provided nearly 600 million horsepower hours of armored mobility across the war. Panthers provided a fraction. A tank is not only a gun or armor. It is hours of movement, fuel burned, miles gained. The Sherman multiplied those hours until they became history itself. One veteran summed it bitterly. "The Panther killed us. The Sherman won the war." U.S. National Archives, 1946. His words capture the paradox of tactical defeat turned into strategic triumph. A duelist can rule a field. A horde can rule a war. The sensory heritage endures in preserved Shermans. Their engines cough at reenactments, smoke pungent, steel vibrating. Children climb turrets scarred decades ago. Veterans touch cold armor, eyes clouding with memory. Museums label them with statistics. But visitors sensed something deeper, the weight of a machine that carried a generation through fire. Doctrine absorbed the lesson. America built successors, the Pershing, the Patton, that balanced firepower with feasibility of mass production. NATO learned to prefer many competent tanks over a few superb ones. The Soviet Union echoed the logic with its T-54 and T-62. The Sherman had proven that victory required machines not just to kill, but to keep coming. The ethical debate never ended. Was the Sherman a death trap, as critics claimed? Or was it the savior of millions, ending the war years sooner? The answer lies in cemeteries and in archives. Thousands of crews died in burning hulls, but millions of civilians lived because the war ended in 1945, not 1948. History offers no clean verdict, only a paradox, sacrifice measured against salvation. By the 1960s, the Sherman retired from American service but lived on abroad. Yet its name still carried weight. Generals cited it. Politicians invoked it. Historians dissected it. The tank had become more than a machine. It was a parable in steel, teaching that endurance outweighs brilliance. The final lesson of the Sherman is not armor or firepower. It is logistics. It is the capacity of a nation to arm itself not with wonders, but with tools. The Germans built lions. The Americans built herds, and history chose the herd. The silence of today's preserved Shermans is deceptive. They no longer fire, no longer move to war. Yet in their stillness lies the echo of a truth that reshaped the 20th century. Wars are not decided only by courage or innovation. They are decided by the weight of industry and the will to sustain it. The paradox whispers still. The tank that was mocked, cursed, feared, and praised was the tank that won. Not because it was flawless, but because it was endless. The war ended, but the Sherman's echo did not. Decades have passed, yet the rattle of its tracks still haunts memory. It is not because it was beautiful. It was not. It was not because it was the best. It was not. The Sherman remains because it embodied a truth larger than steel. Victory belongs to the force that endures. German engineers designed machines of awe. A tiger rolling onto the battlefield was spectacle and terror. Its armor shrugged off shells, its gun destroyed at will. Crews inside Sherman spoke of dread when told they would face one. Yet tigers were rare, fragile, and irreplaceable. They fought in dozens. Shermans fought in tens of thousands. The duel was unequal, not in firepower, but in presence. The paradox of the Sherman was sufficiency. It was good enough in armor, good enough in firepower, good enough in mobility. And what is good enough multiplied by 49,000 becomes overwhelming. War rewards sufficiency sustained, not brilliance starved. That is the lesson carved into history by its steel. This lesson reshaped military thought. The Cold War was not fought with masterpieces alone. It was fought with fleets, squadrons, and divisions built for endurance. NATO doctrine favored standardized tanks, aircraft, and ships. Reliable, repairable, reproducible. The Soviet Union drew the same lesson from the T-34. Both sides prepared less for duels than for survival of decades. That strategic patience was the Sherman's true heir. Ethical debates continue. Was it mercy to send men in tanks known to be vulnerable, or cruelty masked as necessity? Historians disagree, but the arithmetic cannot be ignored. Each month, the Sherman shortened the war. Tens of thousands of lives were spared from death camps, bombings, and famine. The crews paid a price, but their sacrifice ended a greater slaughter. Mercy and cruelty were bound together in every welded seam. For soldiers, the memory is intimate. Some recall the cramped space, the heat of the engine, the smell of sweat and cordite. Others remember laughter between battles, cigarettes shared on steel hulls still warm from the day's march. Many remember fear, hearing the impact of an 88, knowing in that instant their machine would not save them. Yet through all, one theme recurs. There was always another Sherman. That constancy was the comfort. Today, Shermans rest in museums and town squares. Rust streaks down their armor, rain pools on decks, but children still climb them. Veterans place flowers beside them. Tourists photograph them. They have become monuments not to perfection, but to perseverance. They remind us that history is not only made by brilliance, but by resilience. The sensory stillness of those preserved tanks is deceptive. They no longer fire, yet they still speak. The smell of oil lingers faintly inside. The echo of metal rings when a child taps it. The silence invites reflection. This was the tank that carried ordinary men across extraordinary time. The meta lesson is simple and stark. Nations that chase perfection may dazzle but risk fragility. Nations that build for endurance may stumble, but they prevail. The Sherman was not a blade. It was a hammer. Not elegant, but relentless. War itself changed because of it. Before, commanders dreamed of decisive battles, duels of champions. After, they learned to think in terms of attrition, logistics, and replacement. Modern war became less about brilliance and more about weight. The Sherman was not just a tank. It was the herald of industrial warfare's full maturity. Its shadow stretches into the 21st century. Armies today measure readiness not only by the sophistication of weapons, but by sustainability. Factories, supply chains, repair depots, all matter as much as armor thickness. In that calculus lies the Sherman's true legacy. It reminds us that victory is not a moment, it is a process. The paradox endures in language. Some call the Sherman a death trap. Others call it the weapon of liberation. Both are true. Its crews bore the risk of thin armor. Its presence broke the back of tyranny. The two truths cannot be separated. Together they form the essence of the machine's story. In the end, the Sherman's importance is not in how it compared to a Panther or a Tiger. It is in what it revealed about war itself. Wars are not won by duels. They are won by rivers of men and machines flowing without end. The Sherman was that river given form. So when we look at its rusting hull today, we are not seeing a relic. We are seeing an argument, cast in steel. The argument that sufficiency multiplied is more powerful than excellence isolated. The argument that industry and will can overcome genius and fear. The argument that a democracy, when fully armed with its factories, can overwhelm a dictatorship armed with masterpieces. The last word belongs to a veteran who stood by his Sherman decades later. He touched its armor and said quietly, "It wasn't the best, but it was there, and that was enough." U.S. National Archives, 1946. That sentence is the Sherman's epitaph. Not the best. Enough. Enough to cross Africa. Enough to break through Normandy. Enough to push across the Rhine. Enough to end the war. 49,000 times enough.